Pop quiz, babies! How often do you think about the Roman Empire? Now, this is a question that recently took over TikTok and lots of mainstream media. Now, many reacted with disbelief upon discovering that the people closest to them are just secretly daydreaming about the ancient civilization, like all the time.
Babe?
Yeah.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire?
3 times a day. Now, we regularly talk about ancient Greece and Rome because they formed the basis for a lot of Western philosophy, so we felt a little bit implicated in this whole thing, like we had a responsibility to try to figure it out. So today, I'm gonna dig deep and ask, why is everyone so obsessed with Rome, and what does that say about us as a society? So let's find out in this video on why the bros love ancient Rome. Now, while it might feel a little cliche today, this phenomenon is actually nothing new. In fact, the West's obsession with Rome has shaped history for centuries, ever since the last great empire's toga orgy had its last call at the Colosseum bar. As writer Johann Chapoutot notes, just about every ambitious ruler since Rome's fall has sought to assume the faded robes of the defunct Imperium Romanum. Now, Rome's loomed especially large since the dawn of Italian humanism in the 14th century, which flowered into the Renaissance as scholars rediscovered classical works of history, poetry, and science, a canon that fueled Western thought, art, politics, and so on for centuries. And of course, this makes sense because the whole point of history is to learn from it, right? Well, the problem is, whether it's an 18th century monarch or a cat poop 666 on X, people typically don't talk about Rome with a clear historical understanding, at least according to scholar Peter Bondinella. Rather, they invoke the powerful Roman mythos, a narrative that has modified, changed, or even distorted historical fact over the centuries.
I coalesce the vapor of human experience into a viable and logical comprehension.
Oh, a bullshit artist.
It's a mythology so powerful, Bondinella argues, that it's no less than changed the course of history. And this myth is complicated, so here's a little quick rundown. Rome went through 3 main phases, starting with 2.5 centuries of kingdoms, followed by nearly 5 centuries of republican government, and ending with another 5 centuries of imperial power. In modern times, cultural depictions of Rome have vacillated between the 2nd and 3rd phases, what scholar George Steris calls a virtuous Roman republic and a corrupted empire. The story of the virtuous republic was drafted by influential historian Titus Livius, or Livy, who waxed poetic about those glory days while living in the latter imperial era. However, he focused not on the broader social phenomenon, but rather on what Bondinella calls a bewildering array of heroic personalities and memorable historical events. Now, in our guy Livy's telling, Rome succeeded because it was such a virtuous place, protected by self-sacrificing citizen soldiers. Basically like, what Florida is today. Now, for Livy, history is fundamentally didactic, which means that it's a way to teach people how to behave in the present. To that end, he ignored historical realities that compromised his narrative. This guy's myth-making was so powerful that it even made folks living under the Roman Empire nostalgic for the not-so-distant past.
And let us return once again to the sanity of a republic!
Kind of like how any of you would gladly time travel back to the mid-90s so you could have high-C ecto cooler and watch Pete and Pete and Clarissa Explains It All and, I guess root on the first Iraq war. In contrast, the twin mythos of the Roman Empire is less flattering, depicting tyrannical rulers and bloated elites binge eating between rounds at sex parties. Yeah, they binge ate in between rounds at sex parties. If you've been to a modern sex party, let us know if binge eating is a part of it. Eating food, to be clear. I see what you were going to do there. Now, you might be thinking, these 2 depictions seem like they are in contradiction with one another. Well, yeah, they are, and that speaks to how freely people can employ the Roman myth at any given time or place. During periods of Republican or revolutionary fervor, like Renaissance-era Northern Italy or late 18th century America, folks pointed to Rome's virtuous republic to inspire resistance and even revolution. But during times of powerful monarchies or popular empires, like Baroque Europe or America's late 19th century colonial period, Roman imperial history could justify things like kings being total assholes or stuff like ruthless empire building.
Your emperor is amongst you once again. All his wars successfully concluded, and the victorious armies brought back to Rome.
Because Roman history contains multitudes on multitudes, you can use it to symbolize practically anything. Now, many trace the beginning of Western modernity to the French Revolution and its twin American showdown. Ironically, that means modernity owes a lot to images of antiquity. Philosopher Hannah Arendt argues that Roman republicanism gave French and American revolutionaries both the blueprint and the courage for their unprecedented uprisings. Now, most of America's founding fathers were classically educated, and especially after the Revolution, they sought to model themselves after Roman republicanism. George Washington used the Roman play Cato to inspire downtrodden troops. And historian Nicholas Cole notes that Thomas Jefferson replicated Rome's architecture in Virginia's state capitol to evoke the notion of legitimate authority. And to this day, just about every government building in America has followed his lead. Now, this was like way more nuanced than just thinking ancient Rome was a sick hang, like the Vegas of its day. The empire's ultimately catastrophic failure left leaders with what Cole calls the constant fear that a republic is fragile. To this day, scholar Margaret Malamud notes, this vision of Rome as a virtuous republic undermined by imperial corruption haunts the American imagination. My imagination's haunted by just unending climate disasters that destabilize society to such a point that the economy breaks down and that this nation turns from a place of at least imagined stability to an all-out chaotic, anarchic mess where I will not have the requisite skills, courage, or discipline to survive. But that's just me. It's no surprise that the most imaginative mythmaker of all, Hollywood, has had a long-time love affair with antiquity. As scholars Pentelis Michaelakis and Maria Weick write, early cinema sought cultural legitimization by flirting with the canonical status of the ancient world. Antiquity helped legitimize cinema. While early films coasted on the cultural cachet of classical antiquity, they were usually just telling typical romance stories dressed up in togas and sandals. And audiences were encouraged to play dress up through decades of extensive merchandising associated with films about antiquity and their companion mass-produced products like Cleopatra-themed soap or Ben-Hur themed model chariots. It's like how everyone dressed up and went to the Barbie movie this summer and bought Barbie stuff. And they were like, this is a really revolutionary movie. It's doing something really cool. It's not an ad for a toy. I'm not just watching an ad for a toy. I didn't pay money 3 times to see a movie that's just an ad for a toy. That'd be crazy. It's what you did. In this way, according to Weick, the luxurious ancient world came to stand for Hollywood's own fantastic excess, its grandeur and glamour, its ostentation, and the lavishness of its expenditure and consumption. In the 1950s, when cinema was fighting to compete with television, grand epics set in antiquity were essential to keeping it relevant. Now, we'd of course be remiss not to point out that Rome was a pagan society, and that it was actively hostile to the early cult of Christianity. Hollywood massaged this inconvenient reality by focusing its epics on the rise of Christianity, with subjects including Christian martyrs and pagan Romans finding Jesus. In the tense early days of the Cold War, these stories were metaphors for Christian America's inevitable triumph over godless commies. Elite members of the Roman Empire, especially the emperors themselves, were often depicted negatively, as enemies of the devout plebeians. Particularly during tough economic times like the Great Depression, working-class Americans were encouraged to identify with the noble, oppressed Christians. And this can all sound pretty harmless, like bedtime stories for big boys, but there is a darker side to Roman myth-making, and you bet that it involves your buddy, Hitler. I hope he's not really your buddy, okay? That was ironic. I wasn't trying to say that he's your buddy. If Hitler is your buddy, you gotta ask yourself some bigger questions, okay? You really gotta start asking them now. Because dictators love Rome too. Actually, dictators seem to love Rome more than just about anyone. The most obvious example is Italy's top fascist, Benito Mussolini. Now, he used Rome to manipulate an entire people's nationalistic sentiments, as he linked Italian fascism with the glories of imperial Rome, according to Bondanella. This was an easy case for an Italian leader to make, and visions of ancient Rome united his people while shaping fascist architecture, urban planning, propaganda, and foreign policy. Mussolini's Roman rhetoric became increasingly violent as his imperial aspirations led him to invade Ethiopia, in a war he justified largely on the basis of Rome's universal mission of civilization. But according to writer Johann Chapoutot, Mussolini's evocation of Rome looks like surface dressing and pure pomp when you compare it to Adolf Hitler's. It's a weird one. The German here was more Roman than the Italian. It's like when people say there's better pizza in America than Italy, but it's way worse than that because Hitler and stuff. Now, in Mein Kampf, Hitler asserted a racial unity linking Greeks, Romans, and Germans. Staking Nordic claim to Roman heritage required a little bit of mental gymnastics. Actually, it required like a Olympic gold medal amount of mental gymnastics. Now, you can check out Chapiteau's book, Greeks, Romans, and Germans, for the blow-by-blow. Hey, books. Who would have thought? But the point here is that the National Socialist Party did claim that Rome's glory was rooted in German heritage. Now, this was a big power move. As Chapiteau explains, rewriting the history of the German race to employ Greece and Rome as evidence of its greatness was a central part of the Nazi project to forge a new man. Celebrated everywhere from school textbooks to academic journals, Germany's supposed Roman lineage helped to glorify a nation severely humiliated in World War I's aftermath and to justify Germany's imperial aspirations. As such, Chapiteau notes, history became the handmaiden of ideology. Everything from the National Socialist Party insignia to the Third Reich's arches and imperial stonework evoked the prestige of the Roman myth. Of course, like the Founding Fathers, Hitler saw Rome's collapse as a warning sign. So Hitler had something in common with the Founding Fathers. Maybe he had more stuff in common with them. If you can think of other things, let us know in the comments. But he blamed it on Rome's failure to maintain the racial purity of its citizens, which is not shocking from a guy who was the architect of world historic horrific genocide. But even if you're not a dictator, and I'm sure you're not, evoking Rome can still have dark consequences. In mid-19th century America, Southern plantation owners used the Roman mythos to defend chattel slavery. As Malamud writes, those enamored of Athenian culture and Roman institutions made the argument that slaves provided the leisure necessary for their achievements. In other words, Greece and Rome were so successful because slavery provided the upper crust leisure time to do politics and carve big old marble dongs. In the late 19th century, a rising American empire deemed itself a new and improved heir to Rome, holding what Malamud calls the view that America was exceptional, that it could embrace wealth and empire whilst indefinitely or permanently avoiding Rome's imperial decline. That's because, unlike Rome, America was Christian, and therefore impervious to imperial corruption and power lust. Because as you all know, if you're Christian, you can never have a lust for corruption or imperial power, because no one who is Christian has ever done imperialism. Roman imperialism was celebrated in American culture through a wave of Roman-inspired urban architecture, which created a deeply satisfying illusion of imperial grandeur, civic order, prosperity, and authority. Now, fast forward to the more is more 1980s, when images of Roman imperialism would permeate culture and spectacles like Vegas Casino Resort Caesar's Palace, and later its Roman-themed shopping mall.
Just the best gig in all of Rome, a date that every stand-up philosopher, including Socrates, would die for. Believe it or not, you are gonna play Caesar's Palace.
Now, according to Malamud, these nostalgic sites of splendor collapse the historical specificity and diversity of ancient and modern empires. At the same time, she adds, they also sanction and even glamorize the contemporary exploitative behaviors of America's corporate elites. Cloaked in decadent Roman imagery, she notes, rampant consumerism takes on a historical bent and justification. Now, back in the 1930s, Roman imperialists were depicted as the enemy of the working man. But by the 1980s, they'd become aspirational symbols of America's excessive wealth and consumerism. Rome's sheer malleability, as well as its sprawling history, has made its mythos easy to fit just about any agenda. As such, Malamud argues, representations of the Roman past tell us little about the real Rome, but a lot about the prevailing attitudes and perspectives of the times when the representations were made. Like, for example, I could say that Rome was about cultivating culture and people together, similarly to the way that Wisecrack's Patreon does, where we combine the content we make with the support of our lovely audience to create a community where we make more of what we all love while growing smarter and kinder together. And that you could click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/Wisecrack, where you could support our channel, get extra content, and be a part of this beloved and historic community. Given all this context, it no longer seems particularly remarkable that we've all still kind of got the hots for ancient Rome. But given the checkered legacy of the mythos, what agenda is today's vision of the Roman Empire serving? A complicated one. Now, obviously, plenty of women love a good biography of Brutus, and in fact, tons of top classical scholars are women. But as became clear on TikTok, the fascination with Rome doesn't really seem to be a gender-neutral matter. And it makes sense because Rome was not a fun place for women who, depending on your class status, were reduced to either daughter/wife who never leaves the house or slave. So, not really a ton to feel nostalgic for. But for men, Rome offers a safe space to explore its masochistic patriarchy. It's far enough in the distance that the violence and oppression associated feel less vivid and less icky. Similarly, super violent video games set in antiquity offer an escapist site for projecting our voyeuristic fascination while watching heads fly off when they get cut off with swords and stuff. However, presenting ancient violence as normal serves another purpose. Scholar Irene Birdie writes, the modern interest in ancient violence appears to be at least partially driven by a desire to legitimize contemporary violence. In both these ways, fantasizing about ancient Rome lets us safely indulge in images of patriarchal power. And that's potent in an era of widespread male anxiety about shifting gender roles, the post-industrial decline of male-dominated blue-collar labor, and so on. When asked to justify their love of ancient Rome, men will often laud the civilization's myriad contributions to modernity, ranging from aqueducts to newspapers to traffic signs.
Yes, citizens, plumbing. It's the latest invention to hit Rome. It moves water from one place to another.
All very cool things. If you want to have fun in the comments, rank them. Between aqueducts, newspapers, and traffic signs, rank from most important to least important. I'm going to go aqueducts, traffic signs, newspapers. This suggests nostalgia for a time when the sum of our labor felt material and consequential. A time before what anthropologist David Graeber calls bullshit jobs, when our efforts, rather than just being mind-numbing and bureaucratic, seem to matter and actually contribute to society.
I don't want to work. I just want to bang on this mug all day.
Did you ask me here for any specific reason?
Now, of course, it's impossible to talk about Rome's contributions without also addressing historians like Livy and their tendency to reduce the Republic's social and cultural progress to a select caste of valiant heroes. This feels like an early version of what mid-19th century scholars dubbed the Great Man Theory, or the idea that historical change depends on the actions of a few highly influential men. Many scholars argue that today, Victorian-era hero worship has been replaced by celebrity worship, whereby folks achieve fame not through great acts, but through ubiquity in mass media. Rome's mythos provides a countervision, where social influence is still determined by virtue and heroism rather than follower count. And this all makes sense. But to fully understand Rome's hold on our imagination, we need to further examine the concept of nostalgia. Scholar Judith Broom argues that in the later 18th century, nostalgia emerged as a cultural construction at a time of accelerated social change and increasing social instability, as a response to the anxiety produced by such social transformations. The term, she writes, created a distinguishing category that allowed social and aesthetic value to be attached both to the past and to a present that seemed in jeopardy. However, nostalgia necessarily involved forgetting the past complications and contradictions, kind of like Livy did for Rome. And the oversimplification inherent to nostalgia can often serve an agenda. Broom notes that 18th century longing for how things used to be was inextricable from a conservative interest in preserving the status quo. And this feels relevant in an era when myriad social, cultural, and technological transformations haunt us on the regular. From our perceived status as a waning superpower to AI overlords who, despite their inability to render a human hand, will soon take all of our jobs. But unlike our friends in the 18th century, we have what early postmodern philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard called an incredulity towards meta-narratives. And meta-narratives are overarching paradigms for understanding the world. Basically meaning they're like ideas, ideologies, frames of reference that allow us to make sense of everything else. Now, it's obvious, at least to us, that America's deep social and political fractures have basically obliterated any cultural consensus about what our country is, much less what it should be. So it's not surprising then that nostalgic meta-narratives about ancient Rome and America as its obvious heir have gained such resonance. Rome is both an inspiring collective memory and a model for the present, kind of like the similarly romanticized America of the 1950s. What's more, the West's myopic focus on Rome as the sole source of modernity ignores the myriad contributions of other ancient societies, like medieval Islam's enormous contributions to mathematics, Egypt's innovations in astronomy and anatomy, and ancient China's invention of things like paper and the compass. It's not a coincidence that we privilege the supposedly white ancient Rome over these other classical civilizations. Now, classics scholars like Catherine Wilson call it anachronistic to think of ancient civilizations as racially coded in any modern sense. You can read about this. Race as we think of it was basically invented by certain people. Guess who those certain people are? Just try to guess. You'll never guess. You'll guess. But Wilson adds, since the Renaissance, artists have perpetuated the mythology of a white Rome and constructed an image of Greco-Roman antiquity that aligns with modern racial formations. Privileging Rome's contributions to the near exclusion of all others suggests a heavy investment in seeing the history of the modern Western world as a fundamentally white story, when that couldn't be further from the truth. The infinitely malleable Roman mythos has inspired democratic revolutions, energized fascist agendas, and everything in between. But today, our obsession with Rome feels like a conservative force, providing a safe site for projecting many of our fantasies and desires. At the same time, this impulse is fundamentally avoidant. Living in a constant state of nostalgia is a convenient way to avoid thinking about how we can actually make our present world a little less crappy. What do you guys think? Is it just harmless fun to fantasize about ancient Rome? And why does this ancient civilization continue to have such a hold on our imagination? Can nostalgia for Rome maybe make us better? Or is it a convenient way to not think too critically about the present? Let me know what you think in the comments. A huge shout out again to our patrons, members of our special little society. There's a link in the description, but seriously, if you want our videos early with no ads, some extra content, and you just want to support us directly, which really helps us not rely on, algorithms and advertising, we'd really appreciate it. But even if not, we appreciate you for being here, for watching the videos, for liking, subscribing, and clicking bells and all sorts of things. It really helps us out. It means a lot to us. And know that we love you no matter what. In the meantime, I don't know, try to pick another society besides Rome to be obsessed with, and we'll see you later.